Hello and welcome to Focus 54, your real guide to real African news. I'm your host, Prudence Mutimbanyoka, and today we'll focus on this, the potential repeal of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, commonly known as ZDERA, by the United States of America. After 25 years, ZDERA has negatively shaped Zimbabwe's economic landscape, limiting the country's access to international financing and targeting individuals within its government. Now, a Republican-backed bill presented in or before the U.S. Congress seeks to reconsider these measures, offering Zimbabwe an opportunity to re-engage with the international community. To help us unpack this issue, we'll be joined in the studio by Rutendo Matinyarare. But first, let's take a look at the stories making the headlines across the region. We kickstart with South Africa, where Heritage Day in South Africa took an extra flavor this Wednesday with Loftus Versfeld Stadium in Pretoria transformed into the site of the world's largest communal braai, that's barbecue festival, in a bid for a Guinness Book World Record. Over 2,000 people arrived at the famous stadium dancing and celebrating as they braai, eat and taking photos. According to a Guinness World Records adjudicator, the previous record was set in Japan in 2023 with 2,220 people. Participants in South Africa hoped to surpass that number with 2,500 people. And let's move on to Madagascar, where Malagasy President Andry Rajoelina called for unity as he pledged to give young people a greater role in shaping that country's future, following days of anti-government protest and the dismissal of the Prime Minister and his cabinet. Well, in response to these demands made by the youth, the president acknowledged it and asked for forgiveness in an address to the nation on Wednesday. He promised an open forum for everyone, especially the youth, where they can exchange views on national issues as a whole and set clear priorities, citing that the youth have a greater role in the development of that country. The president underscored that the previous government was dismissed for failing to fulfill its aspirations and needs of the Malagasy people. He also outlined plans for a new prime minister and a cabinet to take charge in the coming days that will serve the people. He also warned that those responsible for the unrest during the recent protests will be held accountable and announced a nationwide increase in police presence to restore order. And now at the United Nations General Assembly, a UN Security Council session on the Democratic Republic of Congo exposed deep divisions and mutual recriminations between Kinshasa and Kigali, with representatives from both nations appealing to the international body for action this past Tuesday. The session focused on the persistent violence in the DRC, the implementation of the Washington Peace Agreement signed in June, and the future of the UN peacekeeping mission deployed in the DRC. Last but not least, we move closer to home in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's mining infrastructure industries are set to take a center stage next week when two of the country's biggest expos, the Mining Engineering and Transport Expo, that is the MINENTRA, and the Africa Infrastructure and Built Environment Conference Expo, that is the AfriConfex, running currently in Layo. Mining and infrastructure remain at the heart of Zimbabwe's economic journey, with mining contributing nearly 12% to the national gross domestic product. Now, addressing the media in Layo this Wednesday, ZRTF board chairperson Mr. Busisa Moyo said preparations are at an advanced stage, describing the two expos as strategic instruments of economic transformation aligned with Vision 2030. This year, MINENTRA, running under the theme Beyond Extraction, Sustaining the Future of Mining, will bring together more than 240 exhibitors, including participants from China, from India, South Africa, and the UK. Running alongside the Mine Intra Afri Conference 2025 will highlight the climate smart and sustainable infrastructure. The two events are expected to amplify cross-sectoral engagement, attract global investment, and strengthen Zimbabwe's industrialization drive in line with economic reform agenda. Well, that's all we had for you in this segment. Do join us in our second segment as we discuss the repeal of ZDERA on Zimbabwe. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this segment of Focus 54. We are now joined by Rutendo Matinyarare, who has been vocal in the sanctions removal on Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Now, let's first talk about historical and political implications of ZDERA. After 25 years, ZDERA is now under review for the potential repeal. Has the U.S. finally bowed to pressure from the SADC and the board and other borders calling for the removal of these sanctions?
Yes, definitely. The United States has eventually bowed to the pressure that came from the anti-sanctions movements, together with SADC and the United Nations and the Congress of the United States itself.
Okay.
And I would like to argue, and I think I've argued on a previous program that we had here, that ZDERA was tacitly repealed last year when Joe Biden removed the Executive Order Sanctions.
Okay.
And the reason I say it was tacitly repealed is because the reason why Joe Biden had to remove the Executive Order Sanctions that he was asked to implement by ZDERA is because, number one, the Congress of the United States had undertaken a human rights impact assessment of their sanctions in Zimbabwe. They discovered that their sanctions were hurting women, children, depriving them of health care, and depriving them of the enjoyment of their human rights, which tallied with what the United Nations Special Rapporteur Alena Dohan had also said, which effectively meant that the Congress of the United States had used ZDERA to ask for executive order sanctions that were violating human rights and potentially committing a crime against humanity. And when Congress got in touch with my organization, the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement, we had a discussion about the implications of Congress and the United States government implementing sanctions that hurt civilians and basically commit a crime against humanity. We were looking at taking them to International Court of Justice. The South African government was also talking in terms of doing exactly the same thing, and so they realized the consequences of this. That's number one. Number two, there was our court case that was happening in South Africa. It never got much publicity, but it was a very big pivot that was used by the South African government to, number one, push the United States government to come and answer in South African courts, including Joe Biden had to come and answer in South African courts in the case that we had launched. But the United States was putting pressure on the South African government to say, listen, stop supporting Zimbabwe on the issue of sanctions because our sanctions are not hurting civilians. And the South African government was saying, we can't support any position until you come to the court and prove within the courts that your sanctions are not hurting civilians and that they don't break international law. And the United States president was forced, therefore, because it is the South African government that has to go and has to hand over these papers that are coming from SASAM from their courts, and then they're the ones that have to follow up, pushing the US president, the Secretary of State, and OFAC, and also Nancy Pelosi, to respond to their courts. And as the United States refused to respond to their courts, South Africa drifted away from the United States position that the sanctions are not hurting Zimbabweans, and they began to gravitate to our story that says that the refugees that are coming to South Africa, the crisis that South Africans are facing with the pressure from Zimbabwean refugees is because of the illegal sanctions that have been imposed by the United States. So this case that we launched was very instrumental in changing South African government's position and policy.
Okay.
Hence, you began to see them talking about the sanctions more vociferously in international platforms, and at every single bilateral meeting between the United States and Europe, Ramaphosa and Naledi Pandor were consistently asking for the sanctions to be removed.
Okay.
So basically, the Americans lost a diplomatic battle in Southern Africa,
All right.
and probably with the most important country in South Africa, in Southern Africa, which is South Africa. Then lastly, when we put pressure on the South African government, we also told them you cannot continue to have an ear for the opposition of Zimbabwe that actually went to call for these crimes against humanity upon the Zimbabwean people to terrorize them into voting for the opposition.
All right.
So hence you saw when Fikile Mbalula came after the elections in Zimbabwe, he says that there will never be free and fair elections in Zimbabwe as long as there are sanctions on Zimbabwe, because these sanctions actually force the Zimbabwean people to vote for a certain political party just because they're under pain from illegal sanctions.
All right.
And you also heard him calling the opposition puppets of the West.
Okay.
That was a diplomatic victory on behalf of Zimbabwe because of the anti-sanctions campaign that took place. So basically, if the Americans want free and fair elections, they had to remove their sanctions.
All right.
So basically, Joe Biden did that, and that, in my understanding of ZDERA, was a fulfillment of the ZDERA, which actually gave the United States president the authority to impose sanctions and to then make the processes for the removal of the sanctions.
Okay, so with all that you're saying, what does this development indicate about the evolution of U.S.-Zimbabwe relations and the factors leading to this reconsideration?
It basically means that Zimbabwe won this struggle.
All right.
They won the war, they won the diplomatic war, they won the war of the minds, they won the war of sentiment, and they won the war in international law terms. And so the United States was forced to capitulate and actually fall in line without forcing Zimbabwe to change its policies, reverse land reform, and that's a victory for Zimbabwe. But it also means that the United States has now come to the table to rebuild and reinstitute a better relationship with Zimbabwe, which is what the re-engagement was all about.
All right.
So while the civil society organizations were fighting the Americans more aggressively, the government in behind closed doors was negotiating with the Americans so that we can have a realignment of relations, which I think is happening, and that is a very good thing. And remember, Zimbabwe is the only country in the world that has ever successfully got the Americans to remove sanctions off the country without destroying it.
So let's talk about Zimbabwe's victory. How might this Zimbabwe's political standing in southern region and with the African Union change if ZDERA is repealed, particularly in terms of regional influence and collaboration in neighboring states?
It has really increased Zimbabwe's standing, not only in Africa, I mean not only in SADC, but in Africa as a whole. We're the only people who have ever forced an American president to respond to court papers in an African court on an issue as sensitive as sanctions. No one else has ever done that. And right now we're seeing South Africa facing the potential threat of going under sanctions. And if South Africa, the biggest economy in Africa, the most important bilateral player for the Western world, in Africa gets put under sanctions, it will mean that South Africa now has to look to Zimbabwe to see how we were able to remove sanctions. Already we've got some governments on the continent that are already reaching out to us to say, how did you remove these sanctions and how can you help us with our campaigns against our own sanctions? Because Africa is the most sanctioned continent in the world, and there are many nations that want assistance to fight sanctions. So this makes Zimbabwe the pivot and most important player and country to look to assist in trying to solve the issue of sanctions and re-engaging with the Western world. So
what's the impact, and what the impact could this repeal of ZDERA have on Zimbabwe's existing international partnerships, including those with China and Russia?
Before I even talk about China and Russia, the moment that the Americans removed their sanctions, the Europeans removed their sanctions, the British removed their sanctions on Zimbabwe. So that goes to show that the moment the Americans took a certain position, their proxies or their semi-colonies also had to follow suit. That is a very good thing. So now Zimbabwe can actually export to Europe without any duties, so duty-free. We've got duty-free access. I would actually like to call it preferential access into the British and European markets. And at the same time, we can now import machinery and tools to reindustrialize, retool, and that is a very good thing. And then when we look at the issue with Russia and China, Russia and China have always been our allies, but on a business level and an economics level, there's now competition. China has got to compete to give Zimbabwe the best deal with the Europeans and the Americans who have now been reintegrated into the relationships with Zimbabwe. And so there's going to be some competition, and this will allow us to get the best deal. The gold of Zimbabwe now can go to any market. We might even look at going back onto the London Bullion Exchange. Our minerals are no longer just sold to China. They're now going to be sold to the West. And we are forcing and pushing for them to beneficiate. So we're going to see a competition of beneficiation and factories and industry being built in the country.
So in our next segment, we will be talking about how it will affect Zimbabwe's foreign policy. But let's take a short break for now and stay tuned as we continue to discuss more about the effects, the impacts of the repeal of ZDERA on Zimbabwe. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our third and final segment of Focus 54. We are now shifting our attention on economic opportunities and regional implications. What economic opportunities, Mr. Rutendo, could the potential repeal of this ZDERA create for Zimbabwe, particularly regarding access to international financing and the foreign investment and integration into the global markets?
So I think, first of all, let us just articulate what the repeal of ZDERA means. So I've said that I believe that tacitly ZDERA has already been repealed. And then when we go into the new act that is called HR 5800, they are actually talking about totally repealing it. And they are going to repeal ZDERA without any conditions. However, there was Section 303B. On Section 303B, they then explain that if Zimbabwe, after the repeal of ZDERA, if Zimbabwe wants access to additional financing from the multilateral lending institutions or the Western multilateral lending institutions and the Paris Club, where Zimbabwe is still owing quite a lot of money, then Zimbabwe has given a condition that if you want us to basically restructure your debt and give you new loans even before you finish paying off your current loans, we want you to pay and compensate the white farmers with $3.8 billion that was agreed in the global agreement with the white farmers. That condition has nothing to do with whether ZDERA is going to be repealed or not, because repeal has already been guaranteed in Section 303A of that particular HR 5800 Act or bill. So if we want to re-engage or to reconstitute our relationship with the Paris Club and multilateral lending institutions from the West that had cancelled their relationships with Zimbabwe, they want you to compensate the white farmers. That is still left for the Zimbabwean government to decide whether that is a good decision. In my own view, we shouldn't be taking any more loans from multilateral lending institutions of the West until they reform, because their loans have always been predatory and destructive to African development. Let's focus more on China, that have helped us to build Manise, which is the biggest steel plant in Africa right now, and that is actually destroying ArcelorMittal from South Africa, that is getting loans from the very same Western institutions. So clearly these Western loans are not as good as and as competitive as the Chinese ones. And then, so what else does it mean? It means that we as a country can now renegotiate. So for instance, this issue of accessing capital. Remember that we not only want to access capital from these multilateral lending institutions, we want them to stick to the promise they gave us at independence, that we would also be able to get debt cancellation, especially when they did not stick to Zimcod's agreement to give us the $4 billion then, which is about $12 billion now, in grants that would have helped us to get out of colonialism and to build Zimbabwe. The Western world didn't meet up with that. So they also promised to give us debt cancellation, and we should get that debt cancellation, considering that they did not meet up with their promises to give us the grants that would have allowed us to build from their own colonial legacy.
Okay.
Failing which, then maybe we need to start looking at the AU's policy, which is the reparations for Africans. We might, as well as a country, start looking at reparations, and I know the president has already created a committee that is looking to ask for reparations for colonialism, and I would argue that we also have a right to ask for reparations for the illegal sanctions, because the United Nations Human Rights Council right now is actually working on a bill for compensation against people who institute unilateral coercive economic
So let's
measures
get back to the issue of the 3.5 billion compensation you were talking about within the stipulated 12-month period that was said. What positive progress has the government made in this regard so far, even before this condition?
The government has reached an agreement, so that's the first thing with white farmers, to say we will compensate for improvements. But however, remember, parallel is also the government is starting to create the committee that is going to look for reparations. And the chances are the reparations that Zimbabwe is going to seek from the British and their allies who are also enjoying the benefits of colonization of Zimbabwe will actually be way larger and will outweigh what it is that the white farmers need to be compensated. So if we play that smart to make sure that we put the issue of reparations into the ring at the same time that we're looking at this 12 months compensation, we might actually get into an agreement and a renegotiation with the West where they must do the compensation of their farmers as in lieu of the reparations that they might have to pay. We might even need to also bring in the reparations for the illegal sanctions. You see what I mean? And then that enables our government to have a stronger position to negotiate on how these white farmers are going to be compensated and who actually compensates them.
Speaking about those negotiations, how do you think these payments will impact our economy as Zimbabwe if it fulfills this compensation requirement?
Well, first of all, Zimbabwe's GDP has risen quite significantly in the last 4 or 5 years. That means that our debt to GDP ratio has actually reduced. We actually have less debt to GDP now because of the growth of our GDP. So I would argue that maybe even Mutuli Ngube would say we can afford right now with a GDP to debt ratio that is less than 50% to even compensate the white farmers. I would then say from a political perspective, from a black consciousness perspective, we probably should not be compensating white farmers because that money could be used to meet up with other obligations within the Constitution, making sure that there's universal schooling for every Zimbabwean, making sure that healthcare reaches every Zimbabwean, making sure that we don't leave anybody behind by ensuring that we've got ambulances and other emergency services that are needed by Zimbabweans right now, rather than compensating the white farmers.
So let's talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Yes.
How could this repeal of ZDERA influence this trade area, and what are the implications in as much as the country can influence and its leadership within Africa?
The one thing that I think we don't speak about enough is the fact that the Zimbabwean government had come up with very clever strategies to circumvent the sanctions. So whether the sanctions were going to be removed or not, the Zimbabwean government had created things like the beneficiation of iron and steel that's made Zimbabwe have the highest, the biggest steel and iron plant in Africa. That was always going to export into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area with or without sanctions. So there was always going to be access of Zimbabwean goods, particularly the beneficiated goods. We're going right now to be producing finished lithium products. Those are going to go into Africa, whether the sanctions are removed or not. Chrome products, we were beneficiating and sophisticating chrome and nickel. Nickel is one of our biggest exports. That is the concentrates together with raw nickel. So Zimbabwe is already poised before the sanctions were removed there was a strategy within the NDS-1 that looked at making sure that Zimbabwe sophisticates its products and its minerals, and it would have a ready market on the African continent and internationally. So I think that the removal of sanctions makes it easier for us to get payments, particularly US dollar payments, and also payments from overseas and the West. But as for the Continental Free Trade Area, we were always going to have access, whether we had sanctions or not. And I think the Zimbabwean government is not getting enough credit for that re-strategization that happened when they looked east and when they began to beneficiate our minerals in the country.
Thank you so much for such a rich insights. Thank you for joining us in this episode.
Thank you.
So as Zimbabwe takes baby steps in rewriting its story, the repeal of ZDERA comes as a glimmer of hope for the country. Do join us in our next episode as we discuss more on different topics. I'm Prudence Mutimbanyoka. Stay blessed.